Good morning. Our brief scripture passage comes from 1 Kings 19 and tells of the prophet Elijah and a time of mental breakdown and pain. On this first Sunday in Mental Health Awareness Month, let us acknowledge that mental health and struggle is quite prevalent in our sacred texts. This is just one such case of many. When Elijah heard the risk to his life, he was afraid and ran for his life, taking his servant with him. When they came to Beersheba in Judah, Elijah left his servant there. Then Elijah walked for a whole day into the desert. He sat down under a bush and asked to die. "I have had enough, Lord," he prayed. "Let me die. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the tree and slept.
Thank you, Natalie. To which you said, boy, this is a depressing reading. So the month of May, as you just heard, is Mental Health Awareness Month in the United States, a really important month dedicated toward raising the issue of mental illness to the forefront of our discourse for the purpose of really saving lives, of helping people live better lives, and for really encouraging dialogue around all issues of mental illness, issues that, if we're honest, are too often always forced into the shadows where they're never discussed and are almost seen in so many cases, as that dirty little secret, right? In families and amongst people, secrets to protect. But back in 1949, 74 years ago, a man named Clifford W. Beers sought to change that through his own experience with mental health, and through his work, what we recognize as this month in May was born. You see, Clifford Beers was cruising along in life and looking forward to a promising future as he had just graduated from Yale University and was beginning what he had planned would be a really successful business career. He was on his way up. But as so often happens, life took a bit of a swerve for him, and he had a major episode of depression and developed an obsessive fear of mental collapse, as he put it, especially after the death of his brother, who died from complications due to epilepsy. According to a source that I was reading about his life, his despair became so great he attempted suicide. And this led to terrible years spent in private, voluntary, and state hospitals in Connecticut. Eventually, he experienced a time of recovery, but those experiences led him to want to find a new direction for people that are suffering from mental illness that were in his time. And he had seen enough of the horrors of the institution, which he called cruel and inhumane. And so he gave his life to, as he said in his book that he wrote, called A Mind That Found Itself. Has anyone ever read that book? Yeah, Elizabeth has read that book. It sounds really powerful. A Mind That Found Itself. He wanted to develop what he called a broadened moral sensibility, in his words, when it came to people suffering with mental illness. So with Clifford Beers' struggle, his really real and intense struggle, and his desire to see people treated with respect and dignity who are suffering with mental health issues, our month, this month of May, Mental Health Awareness Month, was born. Each year, in fact, the issue is so important and so forefront that the White House releases a mental health statement. I was reading it yesterday, and just a part of their statement said this: "During National Mental Health Awareness Month, we honor the absolute courage of the tens of millions of Americans living with mental health conditions, and we celebrate the loved ones and mental health professionals who are there for them every day. Treatment works, and there is no shame in seeking it. Together, we will keep fighting to get everyone access to the care they need to live full and happy lives. They went on, as Americans, we have a duty to care to reach out to one another and leave no one behind. But so many of our friends, colleagues, and loved ones are battling mental health challenges made worse by the isolation and trauma of COVID-19. 2 in 5 adults report anxiety and depression, and 2 in 5 teens describe experiencing persistent sadness or hopelessness exacerbated by social media, bullying, and gun violence. Drug overdose deaths are also near record highs, and suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people. They finish their first part of that statement by saying, "It does not have to be this way." End quote. Does not have to be this way. It doesn't. And thank goodness the conversation around it is becoming more and more prevalent, for we all, every single one of you in this room, or for those of you online, either struggle with issues of mental health or you know a loved one. You have a loved one who is. In so many cases, actually, likely what is really true is that they're both true. You know someone and you may struggle yourself. So may this month always be one to say exactly what they just said. It doesn't have to be this way. Let's talk about it. Let's support one another. Let's save lives from a mental illness that generally spares no one. Now, I was thinking of some personal experiences around mental health in my life and in the lives that I have known and loved. 2 in particular stand out for me, and both revolve around friends of mine named Scotty. Scott or Scotty. So I call this sermon actually a tale of 2 Scotties. The first instance was way back. I was in seminary. I was working in many of you know this. I was working in a wine store just outside of Minneapolis, a place where I had been working on and off for many years. And all truth be told, I met my wife there, in fact. Oh, yes, ladies and gentlemen, you all know I met my wife at a liquor store. For some of you, that's not no news. Others are like, what? I didn't no idea. You know our little secret now? We met at a liquor store. Wine store. How romantic. Anyway, I loved that job, and more than that, I loved my coworkers. We had the best coworkers. We had so much fun working late on Friday and Saturday nights and hanging out after work. We were all just really close, and I had one particular friend that I really had a strong bond with. His name was Scott. Scott, as many called him Scotty. So he went by for those of us that were close to him. And Scotty was my football buddy. This will sound strange because he was a Packers fan from Wisconsin. And I forgave him for that. I used to joke with him because, of course, I was a Vikings fan from, the area we were living in. And the Packers and the Vikings played twice a year. So Scotty and I developed this kind of fun thing where we had friendly wagers with each other over the years. Each time they played, usually the winner taking home something like we went high on these wagers, really nice bottle of wine or something like that. And luckily for me, the Vikings were really good at the time and the Packers were not. Sorry to all you Wisconsin fans. So my wine collection really grew in this time with Scotty. What do you want this time, Mike? After another thumping. I really enjoyed him. I enjoyed those moments with him. I enjoyed him more so as a human being, just a really good person. He was warm, he was generous, he was this completely laid-back guy, so laid back. He loved to tinker with his 1970s Range Rover. He was so proud of that thing. And he was just a guy that, I know we hear it all the time, but he'd literally do anything to help a person in a time of need. That's just how he was. He was a gentle and generous spirit. But another thing about Scotty, as I later learned, he suffered from severe depression. Scotty eventually got married to another employee of that wine store. There was something in the air, I tell you there. They moved back to Wisconsin, and they had 2 beautiful little girls, twins. And I saw Scotty and his wife, and even met their little girls on an occasion or two after their move. And then one day I had a phone call remember I was coming home from, I think it was seminary, and someone at the wine store called me with some devastating news. And apparently, Scotty told his wife he was going to go out in the garage and work on his beloved Range Rover. And he kissed her, and then he kissed his 2 little girls, and then he headed out to the garage, something that was not out of the ordinary. That's why they bought this land, and he wanted a place to work on things. And so we headed out there. And time went by, and there was no word from Scotty, so his wife went to check on him, and as she told it later, she opened the door, and she turned on the overhead light, and she found Scotty hanging from the rafters. He'd hung himself. She couldn't get him down, so she dialed 911 and waited in horror for the fire department to arrive, and when they did, they took him down, but he was gone. It was just too late. It's another victim of suicide, joining the unbelievable numbers of those who had committed suicide before him. Depression had claimed another victim, and I still to this day think of Scotty often. I lament that damned and dreaded disease claimed the life, of another good soul. I have another friend named Scott I want to tell you about. And unlike Scotty, who I just told you about, who did really suffer from depression, that was known by him, obviously, and those close to him. My lifelong friend Scott never really showed any inclination toward depression whatsoever. Scott and I met weekly for coffee before work or in a small coffee shop in Minneapolis, and we talked and enjoyed one another's company. This is not long before I moved down here. And Espy and I got together often with him and his wife, and we'd play cards and the late nights. He was my best friend forever, Scott, and he still is. But I knew him extremely well. Scott was working in the programming and software world, and he worked for a company he really enjoyed his job, and he felt comfortable at. But one day, he decided to seek a new opportunity. Something came kind of knocking, and with a much more younger and energetic company, one that would offer him a challenge that he thought he was seeking at that time in his professional life. And he told me one morning over coffee that he accepted an offer to work for this company, and he was really excited to go and to get going. A few months went by, and our coffee meetings became fewer and fewer as he had a much more hectic schedule now. It's okay. The man's busy. But one day he called me, and he was super stressed. And he was really agitated, and he was acting outside of the realm of his normal behaviors I'd known him my entire life. And the job, it turned out, was pushing him hard, really hard, and he lamented deeply making this change. There was so much regret. He wanted to go back to his old company, but they had already filled that position, and it was too late. And I'd never heard him like this before, and he began talking in coded language about ending his life because he'd made this, what he thought was such a terrible mistake that was like a bell that couldn't be unrung. He thought he literally had ruined his life, and he was living with this just deep regret. And I was floored because this was my friend Scott, who I'd known all my life, and I tried to get him to meet and talk, but he just would not. And so then I had to call his wife and his mom, and I told them about the conversation, and they were really startled, and they tracked him down, thank God, and they were able to convince him to get some really quick professional help. And as he did, from then on, his whole life changed in that moment. As he grappled with this depression that had just suddenly just sprang up in his life. Now, he might say he's still grappling with that today, but he's come a long way, thank God. And he discovered running, which I've heard other people say, which he says saved his life after that moment. And he's doing well today, raising his son with his wife and running his own successful business out west. So depression almost claimed another victim in this case. Almost. I think of and talk to my best friend Scott often. I stand thankful that in this case, that dreaded damn disease did not claim another good soul. I'm sure you all have similar stories, don't you? Yeah. I see the heads nodding. And again, I recount these today because this month is Mental Health Awareness Month, a month set aside to recognize, honestly, the crisis. We have a crisis that is in this nation and in our world around the variety of conditions that are termed mental illness, depression and suicide, and comes from that, and bipolar disorder and anxiety, My God, anxiety in this day and age, huh? Addiction or schizophrenia or obsessive compulsive disorder, PTSD, another major thing people are grappling with these days, and all sorts of other issues. People are suffering and struggling with a whole host of mental illness issues all around us, in our families, among our friends, in our churches, on our streets, in our hospitals, and in our prisons, and of course, quite often in our very own mirrors. Now, this month then is set aside to stop and just to pause and tune into an unfolding crisis that often goes unnamed and unrecognized and hidden away, kind of tuck it away, don't talk about it. Even when it's in plain sight, you don't want to be the one labeled crazy, right? So it's a month just to remember that mental illness, as with my first friend Scotty, can be ongoing and known, like the depression he grappled with on a daily basis that his wife was struggling also to stay tuned into, yet it can also be silent as well and can manifest itself in an event as simple as changing a job, or something else like my other friend Scott went through. Or it can be triggered by the death of a loved one, such as in the founder of this month, Clifford Beers, and his story, and through all sorts of other things that can just happen in the blink of an eye. The point is that we talk about it. And along with that, we facilitate an openness to allow it to be a part of our communal conversation that we are a part of as a society, and especially as a church. In fact, I think that churches are a natural place for this conversation and embracing the realities of mental illness, for the reality is that it's all over. As Natalie said in opening that text, it's all over our sacred texts. Did you know that? It's all over the place. You won't often find it in the lectionary, and very rarely will it be the focus of biblical interpretation, but mental health issues are all over the biblical story. We don't have to look very hard. Our text from 1 Kings, it's an easy one. One example is Elijah's at the breaking point. He's been pushed. He lies down under a bush. And he says, I've had enough. I've had enough. Let me die. Those are intense words. That's depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, and fear are all over that story. And they often go hand in hand. Or take Jonah. You remember the story of Jonah? I know it's a fishtail, but come on. We are told in the story that, he's sitting there and he says, I want to die. He says the same thing. It is better for me to die than to live. It's better for me to die than to live. Painful words, depression, suicidal thoughts, anger. The prophet Jeremiah lamented being alive. He wished to die. Same thing. Ezekiel laid on his side for like a year, over a year. And in the end, he baked his bread over human feces. Hence Ezekiel bread 4:9. I mentioned that a few weeks ago. I don't know how many of you went and looked it up. That's mental illness in a major way. We call it prophecy today. King Saul was depressed and riddled with anxiety. David was the same. Moses struggled with low self-esteem and self-image problems. Ever think of Moses that way? And Jesus suffered from anxiety in really big ways. Though all of these instances and more are there for us to explore, the exploration, the church to explore, rarely is that done, though, in church settings. We're all too often taught that we are to emulate, the strengths of the characters in the Bible, right? And definitely turn from the reality of their struggles and not relate to their perceived weaknesses. They can't have weaknesses, can they? They're biblical characters. We know otherwise. We read the stories. We are told, to borrow a phrase from the psychology world, some of you psychologists out there, I want to hear from you afterwards. I know we have some of you here. See if you've heard of this. We're supposed to live by what's called the Lake Wobegon effect and pretend things are not as they really are. That's how we're told to live, by our culture, and especially by our religious traditions. came across an article on that I found really interesting and really true and relevant, and it's around this idea, as a favorite pastor of mine, Bill Coffin, used to talk about, that our culture seems to always constantly instill in us the need to surround ourselves in suits of armor. Put on your suit of armor, meaning we are to show no signs of weakness or need, or rather manifest the reality that all is good and we are successful and we are happy, and you put on your smile, right? This is especially prevalent around mental illness in our own lives and in the lives of those we know and love. Now, the Lake Wobegon effect comes from the poet and storyteller Garrison Keillor. That famous line that he says, if you've ever listened to A Prairie Home Companion, you know that line at the end. Ends each show with the line, "That's the news from Lake Wobegon, the place where all the women are strong, the men are good looking, and the children are above average." Well, believe it or not, there's such a thing in psychology called the Lake Wobegon effect, and it describes the way we human beings puff ourselves up, much to the chagrin of reality, and surround ourselves in those suits of armor to tell everyone that all is good with me and I'm way better than I appear. It's a facade. But that, as the Lake Wobegon effect points out, is just not necessarily true. In fact, what does woebegone mean? I know that's more of a Native American word, but if you look at the word woebegone, doesn't it mean affected with woe? Well, the truth is many of us and our loved ones struggle with woe, with mental illness. And as we're beginning to discover more about the brain and brain chemistry and trauma and genetics, well then, God, maybe it's time we can start to take off those suits of armor a little bit. And the Lake Wobegon effect won't have so much power over us, and we can support one another in authentic and meaningful ways, and maybe along the way removing the stigma of mental health along with the armor. That is what the awareness of this month can mean for us. And God, do we need it? I mean, here's some stats, my friends, and I looked yesterday, and I'm like, what are the latest NAMI stats? I've seen them before. Sure, they've changed, and just grown. 1 in 5 adults in the U.S. experience mental illness in any given year. 1 in 5. Look around you. 1 in 5. 1 in 5, and that is almost 50 million Americans, with 1 in 20 being considered severe. 1 in 20 considered severe mental illness. An estimated 1 in 6 youth between the ages of 6 and 17 will experience some form of mental health episode. 1 in 6 youth. I've seen numbers that are higher. Suicide, like that of my friend Scotty, is now the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S. and is the second leading cause of death for those between 10 and 14 years old. Think about that. Each day, an estimated 18 to 22 veterans commit suicide. Every day. Every day, every single day. LGBT youth are 4 times more likely to commit suicide. And transgendered youth are more than 9 times more likely to commit suicide. Serious mental illness costs people an estimated $200 billion in lost wages every single year. I know that sounds trivial to talk about money, but that's the reality of it. And that number's just skyrocketing. And this one got me. It takes people struggling with mental illness an average of 8 to 10 years to get help. Keep on those suits of armor, right? Invincibility. And with those sobering statistics, it is glaringly apparent that what Clifford Beers began back in 1974, or 74 years ago, something that was his ultimate concern, well, it has to become that as well to the spirit of this nation collectively in this time, and especially in light of everything happening around us that affects our mental health and well-being. There's just so much going on around us to pull us into a pit. So this is no time for the Lake Wobegon effect, but time for honesty, support, and love, because in those things are healing, openness, trust, and a whole sense new sense of wholeness. You know, that last stat I shared, that it takes someone struggling with mental illness 8 to 10 years to seek help. It's a sobering one, but I'm going to tell you in closing, as well as to open the door for future conversations, you know, it's also a really personal one for me. You know, I'm willing to share today that it took me a long time to address some mental health struggles I was having over the past really just several years. You know, I was in a pretty deep state of depression really since COVID-19, right into the end of last year. Though I might not really have known it, or I knew it, but I didn't accept it, you know. My suit of armor is strong. You know, I put that on, and it's on. I put that face on, and that facade is there. But I knew finally that I had to start climbing out of the pit, you know. It really was the end of last year, and I had to start searching for the light. Yeah, I was just seeing darkness. I had to start searching for the light and get some help, and to be honest with what I was living with. And I began to realize how deep my depression was when I started to get that help, and how it was having a profoundly catastrophic impact on my health, you know, on my relationships, on my family, on really everything, you know. And I got help. I asked for it. I had to find the courage, speaking personally, to shed that dang Lake Wobegon effect, because that's what it was for me, as I convinced myself that depression and anxiety were what other people dealt with. You know, struggle with, not me. Not me. I look in the mirror. I don't struggle with those things. I think that's really common. And that's why I want to share that with you in case you are in that same spot. You know, in case you are in that same funk. In case you're in that same pit that I was in last year especially. I just want to say there's a way out. There are better days. And I'm available to talk if you want someone that's walking through it right now. But we need to open that conversation. You know, and we need to keep it there in the open and work hard to erase the stigma and keep working towards Clifford Beer's original vision of a broadened moral sensibility to all forms of mental illness. And always encourage the courage to say, I'm hurting. And you know what? It's okay to let others help. One last thing. Following our service today, I do hope this opens up a wider conversation for us. That's why I wanted to share it. I encourage you to stop by the table in the gathering space over on the wall. It's got all sorts of information. You might be seeking something, resources on mental health and illness, and check out the pictures and the art on the wall, and grab a wristband like I'm wearing right here that says faith and courage and hope and strength, and put one of those on and wear it this month. Wear it the month of June. Let's see green wristbands all through this place. I mean June. The June. I skipped the whole month. I'll wear them in June too. But the month of May, wear it all through the month of May in honor and support and recognition of Mental Health Awareness Month. And I want to say thanks to Elizabeth Cohn for putting that together for us. It's really powerful back there. And Elizabeth will be offering a message on the final Sunday this month of the environment and mental health. So I'm excited for that as well. So check out the wall. Talk to one another. Open a conversation. Take off your suits of armor if you're wearing them and you just need something. Pay attention to the voice inside your head when it says, you know, dude, things just might not be right, and I need to talk to someone. And let this be a reminder to do so, and really a reminder to shed that Lake Wobegon effect, so that woe be gone for all times for our mental, spiritual lives. So I wish you a blessed and honest and powerful Mental Health Awareness Month in this month of May. And I say amen, amen, amen. And amen.